Hello everybody and welcome to part 3. In this part, now that we have our player object and he can shoot some bullets, our next logical step is to create something for him to shoot at. So we're going to create a green blob alien thing that's going to move towards the player, and if it touches the player the game will restart, but we can shoot them down before that happens, okay? But before we do any of that, our game currently is just set to the sort of standard GameMaker setting of 30 frames a second. We're going to change that, so we're going to make the game 60 frames a second, and we're going to smooth out some of this. You can see when the player rotates, like there's a little bit of sort of like pixelatedness or like artifacting happening on the edges of the sprite just from the way it's rotating. So we're just going to change one setting that'll make that much smoother, and it'll help out with all of our different sprites that face different angles, okay? So let's close that. In options in the resource tree, okay, just open that and you'll have a couple of things in here by default, main and Windows. Okay, so double click on main first of all, and this will bring up our global game settings. You see at the very top here, game frames per second. So this is different from GameMaker Studio 1.x, where you would have to set a target room speed per room, and that would sort of become your frame rate, right? Here we actually just set a target frame rate for the actual game. So change that from 30 to 60, okay, and hit apply. That will make the game 60 FPS, but before we run the game, in platform settings here, just select Windows, and this will bring up our Windows specific options, okay, which we could also access from down here in options just by double clicking on Windows. We're going to go ignore all this stuff for now, just go into graphics, okay, and turned off by default is Interpolate Colors between pixels. This was turned on by default in GameMaker Studio 1.x, but it's turned off by default here. You don't want to turn this on if you're using pixel art, okay, or if you're using like very crisp, sharp pixel art, because if you do, you might run into problems where you see images blurring kind of at the edges, especially like if you rotate them or if they're between subpixels and so on, which you'll want to avoid. But if you're using kind of HD sprites like the ones we're using, it can be really useful to tick this because it'll give you a much sort of smoother finish when you rotate sprites around or do other things with them, okay? And you won't get any of that sort of sharp artifacting going on, okay? So click OK, and if we run the game now, we should find not only have we doubled our frame rate, but also our player sprite looks way smoother, okay? And you can see this all looks way better, okay, just from changing those two simple settings. Okay, so it's time to make our enemy object. Before we make the object, the first thing we want to do is create the sprite, okay? So right click in sprites and hit create, just as we've always done. We're going to call this SPR_enemy, and I'm gonna import this guy right here, this green enemy image. Yes, and make sure we center that origin, middle center, okay? You can see the crosshair move to the right place, just exactly as we've done with our previous sprites, okay? And then go ahead and close that. Right click in objects and hit create, and this object is going to be called obj_enemy. Make the sprite match just in the exact same way, SPR_enemy, so that this is now a blueprint for our enemy instances, okay? And this is what is going to define how they behave. The first event we're going to add for our enemy object is actually the create event, okay? So whenever an instance of the enemy object is created. And let's just go ahead, I'm just going to click this button, or you can also press F12, that will actually just unfold all of these sort of external docs and windows. You can bring them back individually just by clicking on each one, or you can bring them all back by clicking that again, or by pressing F12. I'm just going to close that down just to give us a bit more space to work with. Okay, so in the create event for our enemy, what I'm going to do is get rid of all this and type HP equals 5, okay, and that's just going to be our first line. So all we're doing there is defining another variable, just as we did with cooldown in the episode on shooting. Okay, we're just picking an arbitrary word that we made up, calling it HP, and I'm going to set it equal to 5. That's going to represent the hit points, okay, or the health points, or however you want to say it, of the enemy, so that when we take 5 HP worth of damage, the enemy will get destroyed, okay, just as with a lot of different types of games I'm sure you can imagine. Okay, so that's just a simple variable, and we're going to set up another variable, this one called SPD, okay, going to be for speed. Don't type the word speed, as you can see that changes color because it's a built-in variable in GameMaker, okay? If we were to set a speed then the object would actually use that speed, and the game would actually move at the number we put into that at that many pixels per frame, which is not what we want. We just want to declare an arbitrary word that represents the idea of speed or the concept of speed, and set it equal to a value. And we're going to use that value to move our object along later on. You'll see what I mean, okay? Just don't use the actual full word speed, use anything else you want, okay? I'm just using SPD. Next up, let's create the step event, okay? I'm just going to bring this up here. Add event step, okay? Again, get rid of this. And what I'm going to write in here is we're going to check to see if the player exists, and if the player does exist, move towards the player every frame, okay? So if, first of all, just asking GameMaker a question, if the following, instance underscore exists, okay? That's a built-in function. You can see it come up there, and you can see here what it's going to ask us for is just the name, what instance of what object exists, okay? So open brackets and define the object that we're looking for, which is obj underscore player. Close that bracket and then close the other bracket we just opened, okay? So you can see the pairs that we're opening and closing there. And then open and close a pair of curly braces, okay? So this line of code is very simply saying if any instance of obj underscore player exists, do whatever we put in here, okay? And if there aren't any, don't, okay? It's just a simple check to make sure we don't try and move towards a player if there isn't a player in the game for whatever reason, okay? Which is stuff we might do later. For now, it doesn't really matter either way, but it's a nice check to put in place ahead of time. So what do we want to put in here? Well, we want to actually move towards the player. So type move underscore towards underscore point. You can see that turns yellow. That's a recognized function. And at the bottom here, you can see what it's asking us for. It's asking us for an x coordinate, a y coordinate, and a speed at which to move. Okay, and this is why we created that variable earlier, SPD. The x position we want to move to is wherever our player happens to be. So obj underscore player dot x will return the x coordinate of the player should he be in the game. Okay, and do the same thing again for his y coordinates. Obj underscore player dot y, comma again, and for the speed we type SPD. Okay, which is going to return 1.5, which is the value that we set in the create event. Okay. Simple as that. And then the last thing we want to do with this enemy every frame is change the angle of the sprite to face towards wherever it's moving so that he visibly appears to turn around and move. Okay, so I'm going to type image underscore angle equals direction, just as we did with the player when we were pointing him towards the mouse cursor. Okay. That's all we really need for the basic setup of our enemy object. Okay, so I'm just going to bring back the resource tree and go into the room editor. Okay, so on just the instances layer, that'll do for now. I'm just going to select obj underscore enemy and hold Alt, which also will put him in my hand there, and then just click a few times to place a few of them into the room. You can just click and drag them out as well, as we've done before. But yeah, we just want just a nice handful of those in the room. Now if I run the game, we'll find that they move towards the player, just like that, okay? We can't actually shoot them or do anything to them yet, so they look kind of menacing, unstoppable threat of green blobs, but then if they touch me, they all just kind of vibrate on the spot like that. They don't actually do anything. So that's what we're going to change now. We'll make it so if they collide with me, then that's it, that's game over. But if I shoot them, they lose hit points and eventually disappear. So let's open up the step event for our enemy object first of all. Okay, so bring that up, close this down. Okay, so this is just our step event from before. At the moment you can see in create we set a HP variable, but we don't do anything else with it. Okay, as far as the game's concerned, HP just means 5, and that doesn't determine anything else in our game. So we want to say that if HP is less than or equal to 0, we're going to destroy this particular enemy. So if HP less than or equal to, that's just a mathematical symbol, 0, close bracket. Okay, so if that, particular condition is true, we're not going to open a set of curly braces for this one because we only want to do the one thing. I know we technically did the same there, but we might want to do other things there at a later point. But if our hit points is less than or equal to 0, there's really only one thing we're ever going to want to do, and that's instance underscore destroy. So I'm just going to put it on the same line. When you put a thing just on the same line as an if statement like that, it'll just do that one condition, and it doesn't need curly braces, okay? It just does the one thing that you put after the condition in brackets, okay? So if our hit points are less than or equal to 0, we'll just destroy this particular instance. The reason I said less than or equal to 0 and rather than just equal 0 is, I don't know, maybe you subtract 3 hit points from the enemy when he's on 2 or whatever and you end up on -1. You don't want to like skip over 0 and not get destroyed because you're on minus health, etc. Okay, just little bits of logic that you might not necessarily have thought about if you're not used to doing game logic and so on. Less than or equal to 0 just helps us cover all the different situations that might occur. Okay, so that's set up, but right now there's no way the enemy will ever actually reach 0 hit points because we set hit points to be 5, right? There's nothing in our game that ever tells our hit points to reduce. So that's what we want to do now. So let's bring back the resource tree and go to the bullet object, okay? And we want to add an event for when the bullet object collides with our enemy objects, okay? So where's collision down here? And select obj underscore enemy. Okay, so the following code will run if any instance of obj underscore bullet detects a collision with any instance of obj underscore enemy. Now, what we want to do is find the specific enemy that's just been hit, the specific instance of that enemy, and reduce its HP. Now, any code we put in here just by default will apply to the bullet instance, but that's not what we want. We want to apply code to the enemy instance. Now we can actually do that from inside this object, and the way we do that is using a with statement. Okay, you can see that turns yellow. What this does is it allows us to put in either the ID of an instance in the game or an object, and it can apply to all those objects or like any kind of reference to a specific instance or object, and apply code to them or with them rather than with the object that's calling the code. So I'm going to type with. Now you might think I'm going to type with obj underscore enemy, right? Okay, with the enemy we hit, but that would apply to all instances of obj underscore enemy and not the one we just hit. The one we just hit, whenever we run a collision event, the instance of the other object involved in the collision rather than the object calling the event is stored in the word other. So if I type with other, okay, that will return the ID of the particular instance that we've just hit in this collision, okay? So with other, and this works in the same way as an if statement. I could type something to happen at the end here, or I can open a set of curly braces and type in a bunch of resulting actions here, which is what we're going to do, okay? So with other, HP equals HP minus 1, and semicolon. There, okay? So with the enemy object reduce, with the instance of obj underscore enemy that we just hit, reduce its hit points by 1. And then the only other thing we want to do, applying this time to the bullet instance, is say instance underscore destroy. So we'll get rid of the bullet after actually touching the enemy, okay? And then the very, very last thing we want to do just before we run the game and test this out is go to our enemy object and add the event for a collision with the player, okay? So if this particular instance of obj underscore enemy touches our player object at any time, what do we want to happen? We're going to keep it really, really simple for now and just type game underscore restart, okay? It'll just restart the whole game, not meaning game over or anything like that. That's something we can do at a later date. We're just going to make it so it's mechanically functional for now and just say game restart. And that should be enough. So go ahead and run the game either by clicking that or pressing F5. And you can see now when these guys get closer, well, as you can see, what they are actually touching the player there. It just doesn't look like it, and that's something we'll cover in a second. But you'll see if I shoot at these guys now, they get destroyed. And you'll notice that the bullets destroy seemingly a bit early, and you'll notice that the enemies seem to touch the player a bit early, like they're not actually covering one another. So why is that? Well, that's what we're going to fix now, okay? The problem is, if we go to SPR_player and open down here what's called collision mask, you'll see the problem, okay? This is our collision mask for this sprite, and any object that uses this sprite. This is the box that the game is using to tell whether or not an instance with this sprite is colliding with another instance, and as you can see, it covers all kinds of space around the player that is not actually touching the player. Okay, you can increase alpha tolerance on this to sort of make it fit the sprite more exactly, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is just place them very manually and specifically. You'll notice I'm making this particular box for the player way smaller than the player actually is, okay? And that's just sort of a game design thing. You can do it however you like, but I find generally players tend to forgive you if an enemy, say, it looks like it touched you, but the game let you get away with it. Players tend to think that's fine, and they don't really complain about that lack of realism. Whereas if, say, what happens in our game currently happens and you die even though it looks like the enemy was nowhere near you, players will definitely protest, okay? Say that's not fair, you know, you need to sort the hitboxes out. So I find it's always generally better to err on the side of giving the player a sneakily too small hitbox rather than accidentally have one that's a bit too big, okay? That's the side I prefer to err on. But okay, once you've sorted it for the player sprite, you can close that, but then we need to make sure it works for all of our sprites. Like the bullet, like that's way too big. We only really care about this one being on the very tip, okay, of this bullet. Okay, so only like a collision with this space should really count. Okay, let's close that. Open SPR_enemy, and just set this one to be a bit smaller as well, so that we're definitely certain of any sort of collisions going on there. Okay, that should be good enough. You can set those to whatever feels right for you, and you can play and test them, but I'll show you now what sort of difference this has made. So you can see now it's much closer, like the bullet's actually having to touch the enemy object there, and if I run that again just to show you the game restarting as well, when we touch an enemy, they actually have to really definitely touch you. You can see there for the game restart to actually happen. So it's a bit more fair, a bit more what the player would actually expect playing the game, okay? And that's everything for this tutorial. In the next part, we're going to look at adding some tiles and a background, and making a moving camera, and just sort of putting you in an actual game world rather than just this sort of limited, simple black rectangle of space that we're currently playing in, okay? Hope to see you guys then. Hope you're enjoying this so far, and I'll see you all on part 4. Thanks, guys. See you next time.